Hey guys, Beswita here, Ashes Vlogs, and welcome to another explained video. So sit back, grab a snack, for a drink, kick your feet up, most importantly, have fun, like, comment, subscribe down below, and of course hit that bell notification to stay with everything here on this channel. And of course, share links in the description for Simpson Plays, simpsonplays.com, and of course TikTok, Instagram, Rizzle, and Twitter. So then, in the last one, we talked about a nuclear meltdown, just what that is. Obviously, if you haven't seen it, we're kind of going to cover it again on this video. But do go back and see it because a lot of stuff I mentioned that crossover between this video and the last one. But this video is all about 3 Mile Island in the wake of Netflix's documentary Meltdown. So, just what is 3 Mile Island? Where is it? What happened? And why? Well, it is the first major nuclear meltdown that I know of. And it was what I didn't know of in previous to Chernobyl. I had always believed Chernobyl was the first massive nuclear meltdown we ever had in anywhere on the planet. It's what we're taught at school, more or less. They kind of hint, when I think about it, they kind of hint that there had been previous ones. But they don't really tell us what they're called, what they were, what they are. And it's always very funny to me that we in the West had the audacity to try and tell the Soviet Union at the time, but we know better, we can help you out, and we've got better equipment, better safety stuff, and all this in the wake of Chernobyl. We offered to help them out. When the Americans themselves had an absolute shitstorm in Pennsylvania, Michigan. So I said that wrong way around. Michigan, Pennsylvania at 3 Mile Island. And there's a lot of background stuff I need to cover in order for you to understand it, but basically, what happened at 3 Mile Island was a meltdown due to negligence in the construction of a nuclear reactor. And there were many safety checks that were overlooked. There were many safety checks that were covered up, which led to faulty systems that, on the day of the event, the faulty systems caused water cooling to not get to the reactor core of Reactor 2 at 3 Mile Island, which again led to massive overheating. And when you get overheating in a nuclear power core, you get meltdown. When you get meltdown, you're looking at a disaster. And they were 30 minutes, I quote you not, I kid you not, watch the documentary, they were 30 minutes away from Chernobyl. Or worse. And they were looking at the possibility, which they overlooked, completely disregarded, of the entire state of Pennsylvania, or at least the eastern portion of Pennsylvania, being uninhabitable, parts of New York State being uninhabitable, and potentially the capital, Washington, D.C., being uninhabitable. Any way you look at it, they were 30 minutes away from Armageddon and ruining the entire United States. I mean, if the capital becomes uninhabitable, you're looking at administrative disaster. So then, what happened at 3 Mile Island? Well, like I said, like I covered at the first portion briefly, was negligence and cutting corners, but there was also massive cover-up. There was, to the point where they harassed people, they fired people that tried to stop them. It wasn't just the accident that was a problem, it was the cleanup that was a problem too. It was cover-up after negligence, after shortcomings and corner cuttings all over the shop. It was an absolute utter disaster, a disaster that has lasting effects to this day on the United States, to the point where the people in Pennsylvania are not only terrified of nuclear power, they don't want it, they hate it. And you're also looking at the fact that to this day, in 10 years from now, that the United States will go from 21% of its energy grid being supplied to by nuclear power to just, was it 5%? Because in 10 years, a lot more reactors are shutting down. Since the disaster in 1979, there have been only 2 new nuclear power plants commissioned in the United States. 2. In 37 years. 2. Neither of which have opened, and both of them are being looked at for concerns on safety and after followed regulation or not. You can kind of see that 3 Mile Island basically put the death nail in a once thriving possibility of a new power industry. the future of clean energy, the future of the world, was changed by 3 Mile Island. So then, what exactly happened? Well, we have to go all the way back to kind of around 1974, 1974. 3 Mile Island is opened for the first time. Reactor 1 goes online 1974. And you're looking at a time in America, obviously it's during the Cold War, the threat of the nuclear attack is still prevalent, even though the real fear of the 60s is kind of blown over. It's into the 70s, you're still looking at all this stuff going on in America. There's a lot of stuff going on in America at the time, but nuclear is being absolutely pushed down the throats of the American citizens as the future of power. Because you're looking at the energy crisis. You know, we've got an energy crisis now. It's really similar events that we're looking at. Probably why Netflix have decided to release a documentary when they have. We're looking at a massive energy crisis along the world, and energy bills across, not only here in the UK where I'm from, but across all of Europe, America, everywhere has gone up, whether it be fuel, water, gas, or electricity. Everything has skyrocketed in price. And it's down to the pandemic, it's down to stuff like Brexit and other trade deals, and it's also down to the Ukrainian-Russian war. Either way, we've got an energy crisis on our hands. It's still not as bad as the energy crisis of the 70s, where America was importing fuel. America, one of the largest oil producers on the planet, was having to import foreign fuel. And it was bad for them, because obviously the other biggest exporter of foreign fuel are Russia and Saudi Arabia. Now, I don't know what the political situation and the state of Middle Eastern oil at the time in the 1970s was, but I can't imagine it was as great as it is now. It's very operatable, it's very efficient, viable, and easy to get as it is now. I can imagine that was a starting there, but again, I'm not sure. Either way, things were looking bad for the United States. And nuclear was really being pushed. There were loads of reactor plants popping up all over the country. Now, 3 Mile Island should have been the crown jewel of that. I mean, it wasn't, first and foremost, it was on an island, okay? It was literally on an island in the middle of this fork of river that went round it. Perfect for a nuclear reactor. You've got water. You're on an island. You're kind of semi-isolated from the public. Perfect for any sort of reactor. You don't want to be having a reactor right in the middle of a civilizated population. You don't want to be too close in case of a disaster. We don't want to be too far away in case of a disaster. We got what, like I said, for cooling. Perfect for a nuclear power plant. Because like we've talked about before, it needs to be cooled. So it's perfect, right? Again, everyone loves these sort of things. Again, Jimmy Carter's president. He is a nuclear engineer background himself. Apparently, back in the 50s, he helped with a meltdown in Canada, I believe they said in the documentary. But hey, I don't know. These was the scenario and the situation around in 3 Mile Island. Everything was hunky-dory, as always. Now, there was an arrogance in the nuclear community, in the industry, along with the energy companies, with the administration, all the way from government to company to civilian populace. There was an arrogance of nuclear energy. It was genuinely believed that it was impossible in the West for a disaster to happen. Genuinely believed. I kid you not. No one worried about nuclear power. Like today, there is not a single population that I know of, no community, town, city, anything that wants a nuclear power plant near them at all, because of the disasters and the dangers we've all been taught about in school, we've heard on the news, we've seen on the news. Whether you've been alive in the 70s or the 80s to see Chernobyl, or 3 Mile Island, or in the 2000s to see Fukushima. We've all been taught nuclear energy, yeah, it's great, but when it goes bad, it goes real bad. Back then, there was none of that. So you have to understand there was no fear from this community. They genuinely loved nuclear power. You also have to understand that at the time, Vietnam was going on in America. The Vietnam War. and people were very anti-protest. It was kind of one or the other. People were really against the government, or people were really for the government in America. It was really clash, kind of as there is now in America, but worse. There was a real disparity. People generally trusted the government or didn't. There was no in between. There was none of that. There was one or the other. So the people at 3 Mile Island were for the government. Any of that stuff against nuclear power, they didn't want to hear it, didn't care. Now, just days before the disaster, two things happened. The same company that owned the power plant in Michigan, that owned 3 Mile Island, ran close to the similar sort of disaster that would happen on the island in California. The company didn't want to hear about it though. The company hired, this is the funniest bit, the company hired an independent to come and look, assess, and compile a report on what went wrong over there, what malfunctions and stuff that were over there. But continually delayed the meeting and only had the meeting as 3 Mile Island's disaster was ongoing. So 2 days into 3 Mile Island's disaster, did they have a meeting that could have prevented a disaster at 3 Mile Island? It's hilarious. Not only that, but the United States government regulation for health and safety with nuclear energy, the NRC, also complicit in denying and just railroading anything about nuclear power. Now, another thing that happened at the time was a movie came out about the China syndrome. For those of you who do not know what the China syndrome is, if you haven't seen the last video, it is the effect of when a nuclear power plant's reactor core melts through the bottom of its reactor, through the reactor building, that big steaming, pluming vent that we see, the big chimney, melts through the bottom into the ground, melts through the ground, obviously, and into the land, and obviously thought to be able to go all the way to China, melt through the entire planet. That can't happen, and it can melt through the bottom and everything, but obviously it can't melt all the way to China. That's ridiculous. But it was called the China syndrome. It generally obviously raised the nation's anxiety, as any sort of disaster movie does, about nuclear power. The thing was, obviously, it was 12 days before the events of 3 Mile Island. It was very eerie because almost everything that happened in that movie, in terms of leading up to the meltdown, happened at 3 Mile Island. Almost everything. To the cooling not working, everything that happens in that movie happens at 3 Mile Island. It's really eerie on how close the movie and the events line up in real life. It's not great, as you can see, for people's hysteria. Obviously, that is actually what happened at Chernobyl. It did melt through, which led to people having to sacrifice their lives. Go in there. Miners had to go in there to fill it with concrete to stop it from going any further. At Chernobyl. But at 3 Mile Island, luckily, it didn't get that bad. Very close to. 30 minutes away from disaster. So what happened at 3 Mile Island in 1979 then? Well, 3 months ago, before the disaster, is 1978, they bring Reactor 2 online. Reactor 2 is obviously commissioned in just after Reactor 1 goes online. It gets finished in 1978, ready to go. What the people don't know at the time is they cut corners. They did not do proper safety checks on the water pumping, the cooling system itself, or on the valves that controlled the cooling system and controlled the pumps, how water gets to and fro and in and out of these systems. There was many leaks apparently, and there was also just faulty machinery. Sometimes it didn't exactly work very well. They hid this from the NRC and from the government and from the public at large, and probably from their own workers who would go on to work at the plant. So come the day of the disaster, imagine being in that control room and every single alarm starts blaring off. Everything's been hunky-dory for years. These people are not ready for a disaster. They're probably not trained very well. They're probably not, they're definitely not trained for a disaster situation, and they've not had any problems. If you're on a job and everything's going right for that long and something goes wrong, you either panic or you just freeze. You don't know what's going on. And for far too long, they didn't know what was going on. There's too many things flashing. They don't know what's wrong. It takes them, I kid you not, 3 hours to figure out that the water system isn't working. Okay, they figure out that the water system isn't working. They figure out that the temperature in the reactor is too hot. It's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. It took them 3 hours to figure that out. I mean, I personally, I don't get how it took them 3 hours. I mean, you just look at the temperature monitor, you see it's going up. You go, well, that's not right. But no, it took them 3 hours. And this is where this is why I say they're not trained very well. Because what do they do when they figure out that the water system probably isn't working properly? Instead of checking the valves or checking the pump or anything like that, they turn it off. They turn the water system completely off. Now, I don't know about you, but obviously I'm not trained on these things, and I do not know the ins and outs of a nuclear reactor. I know the very, very basics of a reactor. But even the basics tell me to never turn the water completely off. Maybe lower the flow or increase the flow. Change the flow in either way. But turn it off? When the alarms are blaring? That don't seem right to me. I don't know about you. But turn it off don't seem right to me. And, well, shit hits the fan at that point because the temperature starts to absolutely skyrocket. Because there's no water at all now. There's no water at all. Thankfully, at 30 minutes from disaster, one of them figures out that one of the valves are stuck. Okay, one of the valves are stuck. And they turn the water system back on and they get that valve going. But they were literally minutes away from critical mass. The point of no return. The point where that reaction, that fission reaction in there becomes self-sustaining because it's got enough heat to keep going and blows its lid and becomes a disaster. So that is how close they were on 3 Mile Island. Now, obviously, that's what's going on in the reactor. But they don't tell people this. They should have been evacuating people. Because once the temperature gets to that point, you need to start telling people to evacuate. Instead, the company, the management reports to the governor of the state of Pennsylvania, everything's okay. We had a bit of an accident, but we're all good. They're not all good. They're not even out of the woods yet. Even though that they've got the fuel, the water system back up and running. They're not out of the woods. Because that water is hot. Whilst it's working, it's really hot and it's not being filled with new cold water. So whilst the temperature is no longer skyrocketing, it's still increasing. So they're in trouble. They're in big trouble. And it takes them another while. It takes them 3 days to get the water system under control. Okay, 3 days. That's how long it took them to get it under control. To get the water pumping, clean water back in and get that temperature real back down. 3 days. It was an absolute shit show. But not only did it take them 3 days, the biggest lie of it all was how close they actually came to disaster. Because, like I said, 30 minutes from disaster. But at that point of 30 minutes from disaster, there was an explosion. A small one, but an explosion nonetheless. In the control room, a thud was heard. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm working in a place where I don't hear thuds often, I'm not working at a factory or anything like that. If I hear a thud that shakes the room, I'm pretty scared. So, even though in their testimonies years afterwards and everything, when the investigation was done, some of them said they didn't know just how bad it was, that was a lie. Because if you hear a thud at a power plant where you don't hear thuds, you know something's up. And you can kind of guess what that something is. It's about something blew up. And what happened is, obviously when the heat had happened, the reactor had already started to melt. The core in reactor 2 had started to melt, and a hydrogen bubble had formed. The hydrogen bubble semi-popped. Okay, it kind of blew up, and the reactor core had broken and melted in on itself a bit. So yeah, they were really close to absolute and utter disaster at 3 Mile Island. So what did they do? They don't tell nobody. It's not until years later that the public learns just how close it came to being wiped out. It's a disaster. So I'm going to fast forward a bit. Obviously, there's a lot of hysteria going on with the cover-ups and the lies in the media, and they can't even get their bloody press stuff together. The president has to come in and go to the power plant to take a look to try and calm people down. It doesn't work that great. They end up having to get a whole task force together that has to be presidentially organised. It's just a shit show. But they forego the disaster. A few fish die, but they forego the disaster. Okay, they get their shit under control. Reactor 2, obviously Reactor 1 is precautionarily shut down so they can stop the reaction and everything, so that nothing from Reactor 2 can affect Reactor 1. And obviously they have to shut down Reactor 2. Now, come 1983, they start getting the cleanup together. Their cleanup is outsourced to a different company, though, because the energy company doesn't have the facilities for it. They don't have the know-how to clean it up. They don't have the equipment, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. They outsource it to a different company. Unfortunately, they outsource it to a company with a record of cutting corners, and boy, do they cut corners. They cut some serious corners. They cut corners to the point that damns the nuclear industry, because you can't do that. So when the reactor obviously is shut down, because of what's happened in there's a lot of radioactive gas in there. The hydrogen, like I said, there's radioactive gas in the reactor. And they need to get it out. So they have to vent it. They have to get it out into the environment. There's nothing else they can't do anything else about it. There's no other way, at the time at least, to deal with that sort of thing. Okay. The public obviously are not going to be happy about that, but they told the public this is what they have to do. Which is, again, at the time, fine. They build this elaborate venting duct. Think of like a big air vent to pump it out, which is okay. Again, everything's looking okay, it's looking fine. Why the hell did they put it together with duct tape? I kid you not. I shit you not. This is what the documentary said. Those guys put that vent together with duct tape. So of course, as soon as they start venting it, when independent people or news reporters have got their they've got their thing. This is a massive story, obviously, at the time. They've got the Geiger counters. It's just clicking off the count, because duct tape doesn't stop radiation. Of course, it's going to leak out. People lose their absolute damn mind. They don't know why, obviously, radiation is leaking out, because they don't know about duct tape. But thank God, if they did, that would already be it. But they didn't, and yeah, so they had to rethink that. They end up getting months behind the cleanup. They've got to get that reactor out. Because obviously they've put a camera in there. The whole world now knows that it's melted. That it was a meltdown. And they need to get it out. And to repair it, or just they didn't need to dispose of it. Okay, they just need to dispose of it. And their plan to dispose of it was to use a crane. Now all these reactors have a crane in them. It's in there with it. Reactor 1 had the same thing as Reactor 2. It was this crane designed to grab and pull out the core, the actual reactor core, with all the fuel rods and everything in there. But of course, they didn't just do that, did they? The crane had been exposed, obviously, to the same nuclear gas that they'd pumped out. Now, the thing about radiation is it's corrosive. Like I said, if you get lots of radiation, your cells will degrade. the same thing for any other material. Okay, that crane, its joints had been degraded over many years of being exposed to the radioactive gas during the meltdown. During the subsequent years, it'd been just left lying there. And they still wanted to use it in its current state with a few modifications. So when all this happened, it ended up becoming a massive cover-up, because what basically happened was the on-site engineer and on-site manager and the safety, one of the other safety guys, all three of them continued to block the company from doing this. They kept saying, no, we need to redesign it, we need to almost rebuild it, we need to do some tests on it as well. And the cleanup company was just absolutely no. They fired the safety guy, they fired the manager, and the engineer. Well, they tried to frame him. They put drugs in his car, they searched his house for the documents, and this poor man had no other choice. He had to go public. This man was forced to ruin his life to protect the entire state of Pennsylvania. Because if that crane was used and it failed to the point where they then dropped the core and the core cracked, you're looking at a critical meltdown. All that air all the oxygen would rush in to the melted core, and you'd get an explosion. And if you didn't at least get an explosion, you would at least get a massive amount of radioactive gas being released from the core itself outwards into the environment. Either way, very bad for the entire East Coast, and certainly Michigan itself and the surrounding area of Pennsylvania. So of course this man felt the need that he had to do something. And I mean, I've never probably heard a more justified whistleblower in my life, because this is a disaster waiting to happen. And the funny thing is that they do end up stopping the crane. It's not until 1985 where the crane is rebuilt and they actually do it. And that crane doesn't even work. Even though it's passed all its tests, that crane doesn't work properly. You know, it gets stalled at multiple points. It doesn't drop the core, thank God, but it gets stuck at multiple points. That was a tested one. Imagine they had used an untested one that was just modified. You would have been looking at a disaster. 3 Mile Island was a shit show from start to finish. From the disaster itself, the meltdown, to the cleanup. I mean, we'll say what you want to say about Chernobyl and all the cover-up and everything and the lies and everything. At least their cleanup, even though the cleanup crews were lied to and basically used as disposable people, at least they got the job done right. At least they protected the environment, they protected the surrounding areas as best they could. They did what they could. Okay, they protected, from the point of cleanup, they protected as many people as they could. You know, not the workers, you know, terrible conditions for the workers and everything, they would obviously die, and a lot of people weren't told how much radiation they were exposed to. But the Americans were no better. Nobody knows how much radiation was actually leaked from 3 Mile Island, because they never had enough equipment on site. Because most of the radiation was released in the first 3 days during the meltdown. They didn't really count that. There were a few Geiger counters, but they didn't really, know how much radiation was. People, I mean, the guy who exposed it in the documentary, about the crane and everything, he had cancer to the point where he's had to have the glands here and here removed. He had throat cancer, but removed. His his stepdaughter, she had cancer. She had skin cancer all the way here and down there. Loads of other people had cancer. Grandchildren have had cancer because obviously the kids have been exposed to their genetic material, obviously damaged. So even though the grandchildren were alive at the time, years later, grandchildren get born. A few years down the line, they have cancer. This is how bad radiation can be. I kind of skipped over that point in the previous video, in the meltdown video, is whilst you might not be affected, your children might not be affected properly, but your grandchildren, the radiation can get to the point where it gets people who are not even born yet. People who weren't there at the time, were not directly impacted by what happened on 3 Mile Island, are affected by 3 Mile Island. They found radiation in the water, in the land, in the food, in the bloody milk, for God's sake. You know, a milk company had to throw away its entire stock of milk because they had found radiation in it. I don't know how many... In my opinion, just like the guy who was the whistleblower, I agree with him. There is nothing wrong with nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is a definite viable source of clean energy. It should be used. The problem lies with the management of the people we trust to build, manage and operate these power plants. We can't trust them. That's not the technology. There's nothing wrong with the technology. There's nothing wrong with the fuel source. We can't trust the people to operate it, manage or build it. That's the problem. That is the problem with nuclear energy. The problem is not the nuclear energy. It is not the technology. It is the people. As always, the same with everything. Just like with almost anything that you can think of that there's a fault with, it lies with the people. Okay? There is nothing wrong with nuclear energy. Again, as we've seen at Chernobyl, we saw it in 3 Mile Island. It is people. People cutting corners, people caring more about their profits than safety. The only reason to cut corners is you want to cut costs. Okay, it was costing millions and billions. Even today, 3 Mile Island was only shut down in 2019. No, after everything that happened, they brought it back online. They had the audacity to bring Reactor 1 back online. And obviously not long after Reactor 1 comes back online, Chernobyl happens over in the USSR. And it took until 2019 to shut that reactor down, shut it down. It's going to take $1 billion and probably 5 to 10 years to clean it up, to make it to the point that the reactor can be properly decommissioned and everything. So, if I was in Pennsylvania, in fact, me now, I don't trust them to do it properly. I don't trust them. After watching that documentary, I do not trust anyone to do that stuff properly. I mean, it's been years since then, but if it's the same company, I don't trust them to do it properly. I really don't, because I don't even trust the NRC because, wow, the lies are unbelievable. I mean, you get to the point where you're trying to frame somebody to cut costs. You need to take a hard look in the mirror and go, why? What am I thinking here? Because the risks there's no profit in that risk. Like, you're risking the entire state of Pennsylvania and the east coast of America. That company should have been shut down if it was me. I mean, I swear to God, if I was president or anything, I would be having that company shut down. They could not do that. That is ridiculous. But this is what we get when we trust big companies sometimes. But that is 3 Mile Island and the story explained. If you want to obviously know more depth about it and get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, obviously watch Meltdown on Netflix. It's a 4-part documentary series covering the whole 3 Mile Island story. And yeah, this was me, Ben Simpson, here at Simpson Vlogs, explaining to you 3 Mile Island and its nuclear meltdown disaster. So, make sure to like, comment, subscribe down below. Hit the bell notification to keep up to date everything here on this channel. And of course, if you didn't understand it, run it back and try again. Of course, check out links in the description. We've got TikTok, Instagram, Rizzle, and Twitter, alongside Simpson Plays and SimpsonPlays.com. So until next time, guys, I'm gonna love you. I'll leave you. Peace.